I'll admit to the belief that trials aren't the most exciting parts of history. Far more interesting are the dramatic chases that result in the accused facing down the judge. Thankfully, Burr's capture and trial both reside among the most interesting cases that history has to offer. Let's first look at his attempt to evade justice. It's February of 1807. In the cold shadows of the Alabama wilderness, where the pine trees stretch high into the sky and the roads are barely more than muddy traces, a former vice president of the United States rides in disguise. Aaron Burr, once a Revolutionary War hero, the third man to hold the second highest office in the nation, and the killer of Alexander Hamilton, now travels beneath a false name, hiding from the very government he helped to shape. His bold plan to lead a private expedition into the Spanish-held West and establish an independent realm has unraveled, leaving him not at the head of an army, but alone and hunted. He has already faced inquiries in Kentucky and Mississippi, each time walking free thanks to sympathetic judges and clever legal maneuvering. But this time, things are different. This time, Burr has skipped his court date, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Fear of the long reach of President Thomas Jefferson, who has now branded him a traitor. Fear of General James Wilkinson, once his co-conspirator, now his betrayer, and the government's star witness. And fear that if he does not keep moving, he will not live to see another trial. But the South is not as vast or as wild as Burr needs it to be. On February 19, 1807, near Wakefield in the Mississippi Territory, Aaron Burr was finally apprehended. He had been riding under an assumed name, James Thompson, dressed like a frontiersman, complete with a tin cup and butcher knife hanging from his belt. Burr must have believed that by ditching his traditional suits, he would be able to pass unnoticed through the back country. But Nicholas Perkins, a local land agent turned federal operative, had caught the scent days earlier. And when he finally drew near enough to study the man's face, it was the eyes that convinced him. Black and penetrating, they were the same eyes that had once captivated a Senate chamber, that had stared down Hamilton on the dueling grounds. No common traveler carried such a gaze. Perkins contacted a local lieutenant who brought a detachment of troops. In a few careful moments, the man who once sought an empire was under arrest. And just like that, with no gunfire, no drama, just cold words exchanged in the light of a winter morning, Aaron Burr was arrested by the U.S. government. He does not resist. He simply says in a clipped tone of a man accustomed to command, "I am Aaron Burr." From here, he will be taken eastward under heavy guard through Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, until he reaches the court of John Marshall in Richmond. There, the most sensational trial of the young republic will begin. But at this moment, he's just a man in the woods, caught between betrayal and ambition, between the ideals of the revolution and the desperate allure of treason. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's fallen founder, Aaron Burr. Episode number 5, The Trial of the Century. Having secured the vice president, Perkins and his crew of 6 now faced the task of getting him back to Washington for trial. For most of the 2-week journey, things went smoothly, until they reached South Carolina. That's when Burr suddenly leapt from his horse, calling on bystanders to summon the local judge for protection. He knew that in South Carolina, where his powerful son-in-law had deep connections, he stood a much better chance with a sympathetic jury. But luck wasn't on his side. Burr's staging ground, Blenderhassett Island, technically lay within Virginia. That gave his adversaries the right to select Richmond as the trial venue. In effect, Jefferson and his Virginia allies would enjoy home field advantage for the biggest trial the young nation had ever seen. Jefferson wasted no time in making his stance crystal clear. In a special address to Congress, he painted a bright target squarely on his former running mate. Historian David Stewart notes that Jefferson declined to name the participants in the conspiracy, except that of the principal actor, whose guilt is placed beyond question. With that single phrase, Jefferson accused, tried, and convicted Aaron Burr. There were good reasons Jefferson limited the affair to just one man. First, he loathed Aaron Burr. Jefferson had never wanted him on the ticket in 1800, and Burr's opportunistic maneuvering since then confirmed every suspicion that the man was a mistake. To Jefferson, a rigid ideologue, Burr's habit of shifting positions with the political breeze made him almost incomprehensible. Second, to secure a conviction, Jefferson would need the testimony of men who had actually taken part in the plot. Publicly shaming them in advance would make rehabilitating their credibility far more difficult. And third, Jefferson had his own reputation to protect. He'd ignored the conspiracy for over a year, and if the public realized that, he would look the fool. A one-man rebellion was easy to miss. 10,000 men under arms, including Jefferson's own vice president and his sitting army commander, was not. So Jefferson lied in his address, claiming he had only learned of Burr's activities just 3 months earlier. In his rush towards conviction, Jefferson praised the loyalty of General James Wilkinson and released a ciphered letter that tied Burr to the conspiracy. The letter was real, but not the whole truth. Wilkinson had doctored it, carefully erasing any sign of his own involvement before handing it over. If Burr had pled guilty to avoid a public trial, the deception might have worked. But Aaron Burr, now a fallen founder with little left to lose, had no interest in slipping away quietly. Jefferson's accusations sent the public into a frenzy. Federalists had hated Burr since his duel with Hamilton. Jeffersonian newspapers that once defended him now abandoned him. Jefferson's strategy was working. He was turning Aaron Burr into a political pariah. Still, Burr had allies. Eric Bullman, who had once been sent to Mexico to explain Burr's actions, decided to plead his case directly to the president. Captured en route, Bullman was brought to Washington and sat down in the executive mansion across from Jefferson himself. Secretary of State James Madison was also present, taking notes as Bullman tried to salvage the vice president's reputation. Thomas Jefferson leaves us with one of the most complicated legacies of any American president. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He served courageously as governor of Virginia, while Washington and even Aaron Burr were fighting in the Continental Army. He became our nation's first Secretary of State, smoothing relations with France, then America's most indispensable ally. And he co-founded the Democratic Republicans, a party whose ideas still echo across both political parties today. But Jefferson was also a slaveholder who fathered children with the women he enslaved. He preached small government while running a huge one. He called himself a strict constructionalist of the Constitution, only to bend that rule whenever it served him. Sometimes, like with the Louisiana Purchase, that flexibility worked out for the good of the nation. But when it came to Aaron Burr, Jefferson let his anger cloud his principles. Rather than letting the courts and his subordinates handle it, the president inserted himself into nearly every part of the case. And from that very first step, he bungled it. Take his meeting with Eric Bowman. Jefferson began by assuring him that nothing he said would be used against him in court. Yet 2 days later, Jefferson asked Bowman to provide a written account of Burr's plan to invade Mexico. To ease his fears, the president gave his word of honor that the document would remain private, never leaving Jefferson's possession. Within days, the president broke that promise, handing the confession straight to his hand-picked prosecutors. Bowman was promptly charged. Now, the federal government in Jefferson's day was a much smaller machine. The Department of Justice didn't even exist yet. It wouldn't be created until 1870, and only after Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre during Watergate did the DOJ gain its modern role as an independent law enforcement agency, deliberately separated from the White House. Today, DOJ attorneys have strict ethical standards. As Professor Cassandra Burke Robertson notes, all lawyers must be loyal to their clients, keep confidences, and be honest with the court. But federal prosecutors have an even higher duty, not simply to win cases, but to seek justice itself and to protect constitutional rights, even when inconvenient. Their highest loyalty is to the Constitution, not to the president. But in 1807, none of those precedents existed. There was no independent Justice Department, not even an attorney general standing between Jefferson and the courts. So the president acted as if the entire prosecution were his personal crusade. First, he tried to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, so that Burr's allies could be detained indefinitely without trial. Even with a Congress dominated by his own party, the measure was rejected, 113 to just 19. That rejection ensured Bowman's case. The dress rehearsal for Burr's own trial would land in the hands of the local district circuit judge. And that judge happened to be none other than Chief Justice John Marshall. John Marshall was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and in Marbury v. Madison, he established the principle of judicial review, the court's power to strike down laws or executive actions if they violate the Constitution. Although technically the third Chief Justice, Marshall was the one who transformed the judiciary into a true co-equal branch of government. Prior to his appointment, the court had no permanent home, sometimes sat dormant for over a year, and often produced fractured opinions that carried little authority. Dr. Charles Hobson is the definitive historian regarding the life and legacy of John Marshall. He tells us that Marshall brought with him a sterling resume: soldier, legislator, lawyer, diplomat, congressman, Secretary of State. His career seemed specially designed to prepare him for Chief Justice. As a Continental Army officer, he had lived through the suffering of his fellow soldiers and saw the weakness of a central government that couldn't feed or clothe them. From that crucible, he carried forward a lifelong belief in strong national authority, and with it, a sharp mind, a gift for logic, and the rare ability to mold a roomful of strong-willed justices into one authoritative voice. He was also Thomas Jefferson's cousin. At the time of the Burr conspiracy, our nation's third president recognized the supreme talents of John Marshall, telling onlookers that when conversing with Marshall, I never admit anything. So sure as you admit any position to be good, no matter how remote from the conclusion he seeks to establish, you are gone. You must never give him an affirmative answer, or you will be forced to grant his conclusion. Why, if he were to ask me if it were daylight or not, I'd reply, "Sir, I don't know. I can't tell." When Bowman's case reached Washington, Marshall, riding circuit, was the judge. Jefferson's prosecutors, confident in their coerced confession, charged forward, only to be dismantled by Marshall's reasoning. Treason, the Constitution made clear, required an overt act, witnessed by at least 2 people. A coded letter fell short. Recruiting men for an unauthorized invasion might be reckless, even criminal, but unless those men levied war against the United States itself, it wasn't treason. And just to twist the knife, Marshall dismissed the whole case for lack of jurisdiction, noting that Bowman's alleged crimes hadn't even occurred in Washington City. Marshall's complete takedown of the government's case did more than free Bowman. For a moment, it turned public anger away from Aaron Burr and placed it squarely onto General Wilkinson, the slippery double agent Jefferson was counting on as his star witness. That was a problem. If Wilkinson's credibility crumbled, so did the government's hopes of convicting Burr. The Bowman decision also left a lasting mark. It set the precedent for how treason cases in America would be handled going forward. And yet, the facts still painted Burr in a damning light. At the very least, he had been plotting an unauthorized war to enrich himself with land, power, and glory. If fortune smiled on him, he might even carve out a Western empire of Louisiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee, a prospect Jefferson himself had once written might be inevitable. Burr had fallen far. In 1800, he was a single vote away from the presidency, a potential heir to Washington and Adams. By 1804, he was a disgraced vice president who had shot Hamilton in a duel. Now he stood in the company of Benedict Arnold, his old commander, staring down the possibility of execution for treason. But guilt and proof are 2 very different things. After Bowman's acquittal, Jefferson should have seen how difficult it would be to convict Burr. Instead, the president doubled down. Rather than withdrawing the case, the president set about to ensure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. Cabinet meetings were devoted to the conspiracy. Marshals fanned out across the country with 46 questions to interrogate potential witnesses. Historian Douglas Linder notes that Jefferson took it as a personal mission to secure Burr's conviction. He sent circulars begging every good citizen to report any information, dispatched a marshal to scour Blenderhassett Island, and even asked Secretary of State James Madison to recruit Andrew Jackson to collect depositions from Tennessee. Wilkinson, for his part, flooded New Orleans with agents to dig up whatever scraps of evidence could be found. Stewart explains it bluntly. The easiest path would have been to charge Burr with violating the Neutrality Act. Ample evidence showed that he was planning to invade Spanish territory during peacetime. That would have been enough for a misdemeanor conviction. But Jefferson wasn't after a slap on the wrist. He wanted treason. The problem? To get it, his prosecutors would have to convince John Marshall to overturn the very precedent that he had just established. First up for Aaron Burr was the grand jury, and presiding over it, none other than Chief Justice John Marshall. Burr chose a risky role. He would act as both defendant and lawyer. That meant he could spin his own version of events, weaving a narrative that made him look more victim than villain. And since he was speaking as counsel, not as the accused, he wasn't under oath and couldn't be cross-examined. Both sides were given 7 weeks to prepare. Burr, now broke, had to borrow money just to buy a decent suit for court, but he still managed to assemble an all-star legal team. The nation's first attorney general, the top lawyer on the Richmond circuit, and the legendary Luther Martin, a former delegate to the Constitutional Convention whose fiery orations were fueled quite literally by glasses of warm brandy he sipped while court was in session. Jefferson, ever the penny pincher, suddenly found deep pockets. He authorized the modern equivalent of $4 million to prosecute his old running mate, and just in case cash wasn't enough, he was ready to hand out blank pardons to any conspirator willing to flip. To Burr's credit, not a single one did. The first hurdle was the jury pool. Finding 12 unbiased men in Virginia was impossible. Burr's exploits had been splashed across newspapers nationwide. In a world without TV, social media, or pro sports, this trial was the only entertainment game in town. For 3 weeks, both sides fought tooth and nail over the preliminaries, waiting for the star witness, General James Wilkinson. When Wilkinson finally took the stand, he cracked. Under cross-examination, the general admitted he had altered Burr's ciphered letter, the crown jewel of the government's evidence. He was accused of ordering a hit on Burr to cover his tracks, of intimidating witnesses, of being less a patriot than a political cutthroat. Burr's team even filed a motion right in the middle of testimony calling for Wilkinson's immediate arrest. Despite the fireworks, the grand jury indicted Burr and 7 others under the Neutrality Act. Treason would be harder to prove, but the stage was set for the trial of the century. In the meantime, Burr's living arrangements told a story of contrasts. At first, he was dumped into Richmond's general jail population. After complaints, he was briefly freed, then moved into a private 3-room suite at the prison's top floor. He was broke, disgraced, and technically behind bars, but still received visitors at all hours, including his devoted daughter Theodosia and her husband. The government sought to bring 140 witnesses, but the defense managed to narrow it down quite a bit by relying upon the precedent that Marshall, who was also presiding over this case, set in his Bowman decision. While the government sought to destroy Burr's character, the judge only allowed witness testimony that could corroborate treasonous acts while at Blenderhassett Island. Grandstanding and character assassination wouldn't cut it. That ruling gutted the prosecution's case. The very first witness was forced to admit under oath concerning any overt act which goes to prove Aaron Burr guilty of treason. I know nothing. With momentum swinging, Burr's lawyers went on offense. They subpoenaed the president himself, establishing a new precedent. Even the commander-in-chief must answer to the courts. Unfortunately, Jefferson simply ignored the order, setting another precedent in the process. One by one, government witnesses took the stand, and one by one, they failed. Not a single man could tie Burr directly to an overt act of treason. At the conclusion of the third day, the defense asked Marshall to end the trial then and there. He refused, hearing another 50 hours of testimony before finally handing the case to the jury. Keep in mind, this was Jefferson's home turf. Virginia was the beating heart of his political revolution. He was convinced its citizens would back him no matter what. But after just 25 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty. The courtroom exploded. The prosecution fumed. the lead prosecutor summed up their outrage in a single bitter line: Chief Justice Marshall, and not the jury, has acquitted Burr. But Aaron Burr wasn't free. Not yet. He had beaten treason charges in Kentucky, in Mississippi, and now in Virginia. But Thomas Jefferson wasn't done with him. If the president couldn't convict Burr in a court of law, then he meant to convict him in the court of history. Historian David Stewart writes, Jefferson still feared Burr, complaining that the acquittal might make him the rallying point of all the disaffected and the worthless. And the president still hoped to convict Burr of violating the Neutrality Act. That charge carried a far lighter burden than treason. And yet, just a few weeks later, the jury cleared Burr of that too. Historian Douglas Linder tells us Aaron Burr was a free man, or almost free. Because Chief Justice John Marshall, who had already embarrassed the government once, left the door cracked open. He admitted the prosecution had a point. Burr had traveled downriver deep into the West, accompanied by his men, their weapons, and their ammunition. As one prosecutor put it, Burr had been the very soul of the expedition. Maybe he couldn't be convicted in Virginia, but in a Western court, that was another matter. Burr's lawyers were furious. They railed against double jeopardy, pointing out their client had already endured 6 different trials. Enough was enough. But Marshall, sensitive to public pressure, allowed the government to press forward. And as the case dragged on, Marshall began leaning ever so slightly towards the prosecution. He admitted more evidence, gave the government wider latitude, but even then, it wasn't enough. Stewart notes that Marshall was struck by one moment in particular, Burr's odd silence at the mouth of the Cumberland River, where he had gathered his men. Burr told his fellow conspirators he couldn't disclose his true plans. He didn't say they were going to settle American land, but he also didn't tell them his real objective. Marshall concluded from this that Burr hadn't aimed his force at the United States itself. In other words, Burr's habit of talking less, smiling more, may have saved him. Marshall repeated what he'd said months earlier in the ex parte Bowman decision. The evidence pointed to Mexico, not America. There was probable cause to say Burr had violated the Neutrality Act, but not treason. Burr and his associate Harmon Blenderhassett each posted $3,000 bail, and the case was kicked to a federal court in Ohio. So-called miscarriages of justice happen when the courts fail to reach what seems like the only possible conclusion. I'll never forget sitting in my 10th grade English class when the O.J. Simpson verdict came down. We'd convinced our teacher to turn on the TV. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The news coverage and late-night comedy shows had all but declared him guilty. But when the jury announced not guilty, my classmates were stunned. Our teacher? Less so. She simply switched off the TV, announced, "Well, now you've seen it," and went right back to the poetry lesson. Years later, I closely followed the Casey Anthony trial, a young mother accused of killing her toddler daughter. She lied to the police about her child's whereabouts. She went clubbing instead of reporting her daughter missing. To anyone watching from home, it was obvious, guilty. And yet the jury returned the same words we'd heard in the O.J. case: not guilty. The prosecution had charged her too narrowly, and without definitive proof of murder, the jury's hands were tied. That disconnect between what the public believes and what a jury can decide comes down to evidence, what's allowed in court and what isn't. Aaron Burr's case is no different. We can all agree the man was up to no good, but under the rules at the time, not guilty was the only possible verdict. As historian David Stewart points out, prosecutors in the 21st century would be appalled by the delicacy of Burr's prosecution. Broad conspiracy laws and a host of federal statutes could easily be applied today. Prosecutors would demand documents from Burr and Wilkinson, collect papers from foreign governments, and offer immunity deals to Burr's associates. A witness who refused, like Bowman did, would likely sit in jail until he changed his mind. Without those tools, Burr's prosecutors were left to chase him through a darkened room, where only he knew the location of the furniture. The ordeal might have dragged on, but Burr, out on bond, slipped away. He boarded a ship and headed for England. His choice of refuge raised eyebrows immediately. The United States was teetering on the edge of war with Britain at that moment. The Royal Navy, desperate for sailors in its fight against Napoleon, was impressing American ships, boarding them illegally and seizing sailors. In 1807, the USS Chesapeake was even fired upon, leaving 4 Americans dead. Jefferson, scrambling to avoid war, passed the Embargo Act, cutting off all trade with Britain until they backed down. Instead, the embargo crippled the American economy, strangling imports the country depended on. And while Jefferson wrestled with that failure, the Burr in his saddle set sail straight into the arms of his greatest geopolitical foe. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. Every donation is greatly appreciated for keeping this little show going. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.